Eita, que emoção, gente! Que foi isso? O Chico comentou.
Chico commented that Julie would be crazy to promote an encounter of these chairs, and I can deny that he might be a little crazy, but he's a visionary because what happened here, we had the poet, we had the songwriter Mahir. We cried of emotion because of you. I was here and it was pure emotion. And I give it a tape. For me, it's important. It would be very nice to promote this encounter every time. And I'd like to inform you that our next panel will have an international guest for you to follow. If you want to follow it, we're going to have the simultaneous translation. And let's go to that very important panel. Floop is now the stage of a huge reencounter, talking about gírias that the diaspora offers you from a signature, a last name, a family name. Conceição and Bernardine have already met in a congress in Puerto Rico and immediately understood that that last name was not the only thing in common between them. More Evaristos. One of these intersections is Brazil, country where the grandfather of Bernardine lived before going back to Nigeria. It's possible that her last name from her grandfather reveals these tortuous paths of the diaspora. And the family invented it immediately, and one of them went there to register it, and nervous could only remember this white neighbor called Evaristo, and in this intertwine, they found out that it was interesting to promote this encounter again. Let's receive these writers, Conceição and Evaristo. Diane Rosario will perform the mediation. Curator of the itinerary exhibition of Moama Bamba and collaborator of the dramaturgy studios of TV Globo. Good night, everyone. Please take your seats, the seats that are yours. Good night, everyone. I'd like, to greet my older and my younger, to say that this is a very happy moment and thank Floopy on behalf of Teresa and Andrea for this invitation. I believe that tonight we're going to make history with these two speeches that will cross our Ori. So I ask you to leave your Oris clean to receive this exchange moment. I'm going to thank now Conceição and Evaristo, Bernardino Evaristo, with these brilliant minds, and we're gonna, leave this session so full of experiences and knowledge. And I'm gonna start asking about the origin of their family names. We have this Evaristos encounter, and this is such a powerful panel because these names carry a history full of memories. So I start with addressing Conceição, which are these paths that were taken for this Evaristo family name. Good evening to all of you. It's been more than a year attending the Floop. One more year at Floopy, thanking the possibility of being here with you and to the invitation, the public, and all. And feeling so happy because I'm beside my, relative from a distant land. Family name Evaristo that we both carry including the Minister of Human Rights, Macaé Evaristo, who I can probably say that is my cousin. This family name, uh, f- until recently, 2 months ago, roughly, the version that I had is that my aunt, old one, used to tell that she's the older sister with or eight siblings in the countryside of Minas Gerais. When they go to Belo Horizonte, she needed to get her ID. And she goes to the office and register herself and all the siblings. And she always told me the story that when she was going to register herself in front of the officials, she forgot her last family name she would use. And the first thing that came into her mind was a man that was living, some sort of like a neighbor. And this person was called Evaristo. And she decided to use it. And at that time, she put Evaristo. So you can imagine in front of the office, the official, and the official was trying to write it, and she decided to use Evaristo. And I remember that my grandmother was called Liduina Pimentel, and we wanted Pimentel. We didn't have any notion that Miranda Pimentel was the sign of a colonization. And this Evaristo, I don't remember if it was a white or black man. Well, until 2 months ago, this story was, the one official that I had. Recently, gathering some documents, I found a document that my grandfather, that lived in the Barbacena colony, this grandfather was called Luis Floriano Evaristo. So I had this down. If this Evaristo was already from my grandfather, or if when his older daughter went to register the siblings, if she registered the father. So there's this, gray area. My grandfather had also Evaristo as family name, and Evaristo is not a family name. Evaristo is a first name, but there is this generation that has been using this name as last name, family name. All my generation, my daughters, and the generation of grandkids, of Macaé's kids. But in our case, it became a last name, but it's originally a first name. Bernardine has a more interesting story about this family name, and I envy her for that. Bernardine, tell me a little bit about this story that, comes from your grandfather. It goes back to Nigeria, and we have this sharing, that maybe he's part of these slaves that were enslaved that go back to Nigeria, and this searching for your family that is erased in the face of all these violences. Sim, sim. Então, apenas para dizer que é incrível.
Rio. I took part in FLOP in 2013, which was my last time in Brazil, and I had an amazing time, and I've been having an amazing time here. And it's also wonderful to be sharing the stage with Conceição, because people have been telling me about her for years, because we share the same surname. So people have been saying to me, "Oh, do you know about her? Have you read her? Have you met her?" So finally, we met today, and she is a total delight. So it's been really lovely to get to know you a little. So I am English, obviously, but my father was Nigerian, my mother was English, and my father's surname was Evaristo. And when I was growing up, we thought that was his Nigerian name. He is of the Yoruba of Nigeria, and we didn't realize it was a Brazilian name or Portuguese name because he never told us. And then when I was about 26, I was asking him questions about his childhood because he really didn't tell us anything about his life in Nigeria. And he had left Nigeria in 1949. And this is now in the middle of the 80s. And he just casually told me, oh yes, your grandfather was Brazilian. And we didn't know that. He said, that's why your name is Evaristo. So it's very strange that there was such little communication with him, even though we all grew up with him, that we didn't know it was a Brazilian surname. So I subsequently discovered that my grandfather was called Gregorio Bankole, which is a Yoruba name, Evaristo. And he lived in the Brazilian quarter of Lagos, which no longer really exists, but it was where the formerly enslaved Africans settled when they sailed back from Brazil towards the end of the 19th century after the end of slavery. And so they chartered boats and sailed back to the west coast of Africa and settled along the west coast. And there were some very big Brazilian families, such as the Da Silvas and the Da Souzas, but there was also the Evaristos, which was my father's name, and my father grew up in the Brazilian quarter, which had previously been called Portuguese Town because it had been settled by Portuguese traders and enslavers. And when I first went to Nigeria in about 91, I visited the Brazilian quarter, and there were still buildings there that looked very much like the buildings you see in Rio, you know, the very old buildings. So it was very interesting getting a sense of the quarter as it had been. When I went back more recently, those buildings had pretty much all gone. So when I first came to Brazil in 1992, I went to Bahia to try and find my family, thinking somehow I could find the Evaristos. Of course, that was a silly thing to do, and I couldn't find anything. But Bahia felt very much like Lagos. You know, there were women wearing sort of some of the traditional Yoruba clothes. They were selling Yoruba food on the street, and it was so interesting to see that sort of over 100 years after people had sailed back to West Africa, there was still a very strong West African influence in Bahia. And that's the meaning of the name to me, really. And my grandfather died. My father was born in about 1927, and my grandfather died before he was born. So that history disappeared with him, and I don't know much about him. He was a customs officer in Nigeria, and I've got a photograph of him, and he's very smart, and he looks like he looks like he's the man, and very, very strong-looking individual, but very smart, slightly flamboyant. But I don't know much more about him.
It's very interesting, you know, look and you search for your memory. Black people would not so much register. You have the photo, the images, the documents. That makes so that we lack this reference. And that's being brought back in this writing that you were building, you know, and thinking about the diaspora. You bring the diaspora in your work. I'd like to understand a little bit how you think about this transatlantic identity, the idea of being water, to think about the building of these characters from the diaspora, you know.
Of the African diaspora, and that's what I write about. You know, past, present, future, real, imagined. I feel that it's a wonderfully fertile territory to novels. The novel that you'll probably know here is Girl, Woman, Other. My novels tend to they all explore aspects of the African diaspora, but from a British perspective. And when I grew up in the UK in the 1960s and 70s, the society was very white. I didn't know anything about my Nigerian heritage because my father didn't pass it on to my father. It's gone really loud. Okay. Is that better? Okay, I didn't think it was on. I didn't know anything about my Nigerian heritage, and I think my father was ashamed of his Nigerian heritage. He came over in 1949 and he didn't return to Nigeria until 1993 when I took him back. So I didn't grow up with a really strong black identity, and I was also biracial, growing up in a white area. And so it was only when I was about 19 that I went to drama school to train to be an actor, which was my first career, that I started to mix with other black women and started to solidify a really strong black identity, and really wanted to write about the stories that hadn't been told, you know, to write about African history, because I was discovering African history. And even today, most people in the UK don't know about African history. I would say a lot of black people in Britain don't know about African history. You have to decide to seek it out. And so I did that work for many years, which was all about me strengthening my identity and my sense of self and counteracting the very white upbringing that I had had, which was complicated because I was very British. As you can hear, I sound very British, but when people looked at me, they didn't accept me as British because I had a brown skin. But everything else about me was very, very kind of British, right? But people treated me differently. And to then become part of a black community and the black feminist community, most importantly, and to interrogate African history, African culture and society, drawing on the incredible African-American women writers who were pretty much the only women writing en masse in the world who were black women, and writing black women's stories in America at that time. I'm talking about the sort of 80s. There were other black women writing around the world, but not in the way that the African-American women were. You know, there were many, many, many of them. And you will know many of them, the names of at least some of them, because they are still sort of global superstars. So I had to discover my blackness, and then at the same time I was writing. I was writing as a theatre maker, and then I was writing books. And I was always wanting to put presence into absence, right? Because if we don't do that, nobody else is going to do it for us. And when they try to do it, they don't always do a very good job of it. So as a black British writer, and there are many more of us now, but still not enough, if we don't write about Black Britain and Black British stories, then we continue to remain invisible. I just want to shout out, actually, to Afua Hirsch, who is here somewhere. Where is she? Afua! So she is my sister from the UK. And so there's two of us, at least two of us here from the UK. And Afua wrote an incredible book called Brit-ish, which is all about exploring Black British identity, but also through her work. She is always exploring Africa, the African diaspora, African heritage and stuff, and doing that really important work. And while there are many more of us today, there still aren't enough of us doing it. And together, we are recreating British narrative, world history, and putting our stories out there and showing that our stories are as important and valid and interesting as any other culture and society.
Incrível que a gente está falando sobre projetos de continuidade, né? Então, agora a Conceição.
So, Conceição, we're talking about continuity projects. So what do you think about this transatlantic identities? So this fundamental place that we, Black Brazilian, in which we create our identity, is maybe through oral stories that are being, passed on in time. And maybe there's something in Brazilian society, and as Black person, I remember my family, my surroundings, this experience or this conscious, diffuse conscious of our blackness. I think it has always existed, mainly through the odor. What we didn't have was this speech built about it, you know? I think there is this living experience, and it happens through arts, and we see it in Afro-Brazilian religions like Candomblé, Umbanda, and also we see it in this Black Catholic religion. You know, when we talk about congadas, it's interesting that congadas celebrate these Christian myth, and all the way they celebrated the performances are extremely signed by black culture and also by this black culture. So if you ever seen a congada, you probably noticed that congada, when they are, parading, they they are they are turning their backs, and the songs, praising the Christian myth, but in the lyrics you can read the word Zambi. This reference to our blackness existed, but maybe from starting on in the 70s, it becomes an affirmation and strongly, signed by these struggles, by these fights for freedom and for the liberation and the struggle for the liberation of African colonies. And what maybe allows us to have this cultural black memory and allows it to keep itself within us is this, you know, disguise that our Brazilian society has, especially when dealing with racism. And while for a subject, the way the society reads us and reads our cultural manifestations, they think that everything is about celebration, But the celebration has for us this other flavor of resistance. So, and it's interesting also notice that the Brazilian identity, and not only the Afro-Brazilian, but the Brazilian identity, and here I will quote Ivani Santos, when the Brazilian goes abroad, nobody asks him or her, do you know this valse? You might be black or white. Do you know how to dance valse? Do you know how to dance polka, waltz? Nobody asks you that. Usually, people ask or imagine that Brazilian, white or black, more of the black ones, they imagine that we dance samba. So, black cultures signed and marked deeply our Brazilian way of living, Brazilianity, but in a very contradictory way. While we have this memory of leisure, everything is possible. When we are talking about reivindicating politically matters, things, change place. And remembering this black memory that is present in our unconscious or collective unconscious in Brazil. I grew up listening that girls that would go across the rainbow will become boys, and girls that go through the rainbow, they become boys, and vice versa. And I start to think about it. I needed to come back to Rio because this is a very Catholic state, and I come from a very Catholic one, Minas, and I came to Rio to find out in Candomblé about this narrative of Uxumari, which is an Orisha. They call it Mita Mita because sometimes it's a male Orisha and sometimes it's a female Orisha. And what do I mean by this? This memory, Christianity did not erase. My mother is deeply Catholic and she never heard about this narrative, about this myth. But this memory belongs to a narrative that might lost its origin, but it didn't lose the essence of the fact. So maybe this blackness has always existed in us, but it was not built, it was not said, it did not become a theory. So when you talk about a literature and in terms of identity in Brazil, this would be considered a literature in terms of identity. And we cannot forget and should not forget that the white people always created literature for identity, their references, their heroes, the way, the content they were using. It was always regarding identity. But when groups that were considered subordinated, such as women, gays, blacks, indigenous, create a literature, they fictionalize a part of their experiences. This is considered literature in terms of identity. It reminds me of this construction of the resistance strategies for Black memories. We create new languages, whether in literature or with images, and we create this to pass on these memories, And I'd like to ask you, what are the waters that, boost your writing and inspirates you, that gives you the motivation to go on writing, and how does this movement works? So,
I'm very, very curious about the human race and people, and I'm very interested in power dynamics. I'm very interested in injustice. I'm extremely interested in how we are racialized as Black people and how we move through the world because of that. I have been a feminist since I was first introduced to it when I was 19, and I'm particularly interested in women's stories. And all of this is inspiration for me as a writer. This is aside from the ways in which I'm inspired by other art forms, other writers, and so on. And so somebody said to me, I did an event in Sao Paulo, and somebody said to me, what does writing mean to you? And I said, at this stage in my life, it's in my DNA. It is how I exist in the world, and it is how I process everything that I witness around me in the world, how I process it emotionally, psychically, intellectually, and it all goes into my writing. I don't know what I would do with my life if I wasn't transforming everything I witness and experience and think somehow into fiction, essentially, and creating fictional characters. So the inspiration is all of those things. And the drive is that, just to return to this idea, that I know that if I don't do it, and other writers such as Afua and other British writers, and of course writers here and all over the world, that if we don't do it, it won't exist. I'll tell you a sort of a little example of this. So in the UK, there's been a very long journey to becoming a more inclusive literary society, and it's now more inclusive than it's ever been, which is fantastic. And the first writers who were published en masse in the UK were men from the Caribbean who came into Britain in the 1940s and 50s, essentially. And they were writing novels that were published in the UK, and they were novels about men. And if women were featured, they were featured in quite a derogatory way. And it wasn't until the 1990s that a number of black women started to get published, and when they were publishing novels. And it was so interesting because I did some research not so long ago into these novels, and I knew most of the writers and I knew most of the books at the time. But what the pattern I detected was that these women writers who were then in their 20s and 30s and were writing debut books, were writing about childhood and about they were sort of coming of age stories, and they were looking at family dynamics and so on. And there was a real trend with these writers, and it was as if for the first time in a considerable number, black British women were using their voice to tell stories. And nearly all of those stories touched on, in some way, sexual abuse. And it was really shocking to think about that, inside the family, outside the family. And this is something that wouldn't have been aired if these women had not written these stories, these fictional stories. And we know the stories come out of somewhere. And it was almost as if this hidden part of our society was suddenly being aired. Now, the male writers, the male counterparts who were publishing in the 90s were doing something completely different. And they weren't so introspective, they weren't so personal, emotional, or domestic. But the women writers were doing all of this. And it was just a really important thing to realize that this is what had happened. And this is why it's so important for women's fiction to be out there. Because there's I've been talking to people here. We know that so many of these stories are buried, and they need the first step of healing is for us to be able to vocalize them. And sometimes it's through fiction. And as I said, I'm very interested in people, so while I spend a lot of my life sitting on a stage talking about myself, I don't actually find myself that interesting. I find you all much more interesting. I'm much happier listening to people and asking questions. So I'm really interested in human psychology, and I'm not a psychologist, but I'm really interested in who we are as people and why we do the things that we do, trying to understand where people come from, what their goals and desires are, and then to create stories around that. So that is a huge inspiration for me, how I process human behavior through everybody I know, everybody I've encountered, and also myself.
A escrita como uma ferramenta de cura, né? E nos bastidores, de fato, o Bernardinho perguntou quem eu era, o que eu fazia, se eu era só a mestre de cerimônia, o que eu fazia, né? Fora daqui.
Why? What did I do? So it was very interesting to understand this process of exchange, because it's not only a process of writing, but it's a process of cure. And I think that this process of writing, where you put this tool to cure and to heal these sufferings and these pains, I think it transcends its function. So thank you very much for sharing. While my cousin Bernardine is a psychologist, and that she asks because she wants to know people, I am a gossiper. But I don't tell anyone. I just tell to the readers. And so the person, of course, doesn't know the characters that inspire me. So it's in the level of the sophisticated. The writer is the responsible. But I have a lot of curiosity. My matter of writing is a living matter, very related to life. The last lines of the novel, the, the gesture of Gé Absenso was to grab life and art as if it were the same thing. They were the same thing. Sometimes she would grab life, sometimes she would grab art. And what inspires me to write is always life, people, the events around us, a lot similar to what Bernardini does through the psychology. The questions. Sometimes people start telling me stories, and I start elaborating a text in my mind. And I ask the person, did you write about this? The person says no. I said, okay, so I'll write. So this exercise of listening, the other, of changing subjects and ask about life, and then return this in the form of a text, but return according our perspective, our condition, according to our experience. So I have been using this as an example, let's suppose that I have to write a scene in which the domestic worker has burned the dress of her boss, her woman boss. So let's think, what would happen to the maid and what would be her feeling at that moment, and what would also happen to the boss. I could write 4 lines about the boss, and the rest of the text would be around the maid. Or when I write Maria's Tale, or when I write a song, a lullaby song for a big boy, it's always from the observation and the condition of those who are near me. I'm not interested in describing or writing what contaminates me, what calls me, is our life. I want to have Black protagonists in the center of the scene through our experiences, and distancing as much as possible from the characters of this other literature that is already defined and the places they define for us. So when I create a text, as much as I enjoy, for example, some books like Gabriela, Cravo e Canela of Jorge Amado, as much as I enjoy any other classical novel talking about the condition of life of a poor population, Maria is not Gabriela. Ana Gavenga is not Rita Baiana. So it's contaminated by my experience, my condition of Black woman in the Brazilian society, that my writings, critical and creative, and he says, they are our texts. They are ours. So the affirmative, our writing experiences are not for the owners, but they are to wake them up, to wake them from the sleeping dreams of the unjust. Bernardine, Your writings are fundamental for the world literature, and I'd like to understand what do you expect for the next generations based on the writings that you are building?
So it's a really interesting question because a lot has changed in my lifetime in the UK, just as I know quite a lot has changed here since I was last here in 2013. I was in Megafauna bookshop in Sao Paulo, and they had this huge section in both bookshops, there are two of them, and they were all books by black women translated into Portuguese or written in Portuguese. And I was like, I have never seen this before, and I rarely see this. I don't know if I've ever seen this anywhere in the world other than maybe America. So I can see that changes have happened here. But in my lifetime, it was very hard for black writers of my generation to get published. I'm one of the very few who's had quite a long career now, because the publishing industry wasn't interested in our work. And what they said was, well, you're black British and you're writing black British stories, and only black British people will be interested in those stories, and they don't read books. So we're not going to publish you. That's the sort of thing that they said in the 80s, and even in the 90s, and even now occasionally I hear people say that. So there was this belief that if you wrote a book about a black family in Britain, only black people would be interested in it. Now, we are a very small minority in the UK, so the market is immediately in their imagination reduced. But the whole point of literature is that literature transcends the specific experiences that you're writing about. You know, sort of the great playwright Shakespeare, you know, he's writing these stories that people don't have those lived experiences now. They're sort of 500 years old, but they still have great currency in our society. So if people are interested in Shakespeare, why would they not be interested in, for example, contemporary black British stories? So there was I've been very much an activist throughout the whole of my career. So we've applied a lot of pressure to the publishing industry over many years to get them to open their doors. And finally, yes, George Floyd's murder was a turning point, but even before then, they started to realize that there was this untapped demographic of writing in Britain that was really interesting, really fresh, really vital, very original, because we hadn't really told our stories in great numbers before, and they realized that there was a market for these books beyond the particular demographic that we're writing about, and so everything started to change. So I would say that the generation today they have been walking into an industry that has had their doors opened for them in the last few years. It has never been easier for black British people and black British women to be published in the UK. Unfortunately, there's somebody called Trump in America who unfortunately sets a kind of moral climate that is so regressive and so powerful that it does filter around the rest of the world. And, you know, his anti-progressive stance, I really worry that it will seep into British life more than it is currently, and that those doors will start to close. But from this position at the moment, I would say that the literature industry for black people is healthier than it's ever been, and that for the next generation coming through, that there are infinite possibilities for them to write whatever kinds of stories they want, because the other problem has been that the industry has wanted people to write certain kinds of stories that they think our communities are about. And crime is one of them, for example. So we've now moved beyond that. And so people are publishing all kinds of books in all kinds of genres. Some of these books are becoming bestsellers and doing really well. And the task is on to maintain this momentum but because there is such a dangerous climate in the world at the moment, we have to keep up the campaigning and the lobbying, because if we don't, I fear that we will slip back to where we were 10, 20, 30 years ago, when we were kind of invisible, more or less, in the publishing industry.
Politics, is intertwined with black bodies, crosses black bodies. So we have to try to create tools for survival daily. And I'd like to know from you, how do you understand this continuity for generations? Should I go back to the world literature? Because when we think, about our texts, Bernardine being translated in Portuguese here in Brazil, and our relation with Afro writers, African American writers, our generations, our readers, and our writers of books of African authors, especially of Portuguese language. It's also from the Caribbean. What do we notice when Delay Jacari here, our companion, our partner in our collective of black writers, and what was the previous name? Negrician. This was a moment when we were feeling so alone, in a moment of this impression that black could only write to black. And this vision was being, torn apart. And when we were trying to demand, or when trying to reivindicate a black writer, or when we were trying to demand a nomination as, black Brazilian writing, black Brazilian literature, there was always a critic saying that no, literature is universal. And there is no such thing as black or Afro-Brazilian literature, feminine literature. Literature is universal. And time was passing by, and we realized that the ones who create universal literature are us, because there are many works, many books that are, well established, and then don't invite the subjected community, the subjected women, the gays, the gay community, because these books may be beautiful, amazing, but they follow some sort of pattern. They animalize certain social groups. And what do we find out? That our literature, born from a very specific place, from a very specific experience, is a literature that is translated into English, French, Arabian, Italian. So there is something in our literature that is much more the sense of universality, the sense of universal. That in Brazil, the first place where my book was received was the Black movement. And when I see white men, white women, children, rich, poor, Brazilians, foreigners being touched, moved by my texts and by other black authors' texts or indigenous authors. So, who are the ones writing universal literature? Who creates this universal art? We do. And we create it through our through our specific pictures. And I forgot what you asked. All right, I remember now. I remember. I asked about the generations, the tools for, giving continuity to. So the tools to give continuity to the next generations are there. These generations have all they need. Why? Because when we started it right, we didn't have publishing houses that were betting on us. And now we have publishing houses that want our work. I didn't publish with a big house yet. I haven't done it because I take my time to write, very slowly. And one day maybe I could, but when Osvaldo de Camargo, and I don't want to say Osvaldo de Camargo, the one that is 93 years old, it wasn't his name, 90 something. Carlos de Assunção, someone said. Yeah, Carlos de Assunção. When he arrives at Companhia das Letras publishing house, I think he was already 90 something, or 90 years old, or almost there, And Gucci is there in. So that means that we have readers. We in such a publishing house such as that one will not invest in a writer if this house does not believe that this author will give something back, in financial terms. So, Delay, I'm not saying that you are old, but an older generation like Delay, like me, like Semog, like Osvaldo de Camargo, like people from Black Cadernos Negros, like Vera, who's there, I'm seeing you. This generation paved the way. So it's not that today it's easier, extremely easier, but you have less problems. For this, these black authors have less issues, less problems to overcome to arrive to these big publishing houses. And when we think about literature, it's not only the text, it's the policy for distribution of books. You have the bibliotheques, you have prizes, awards, marketing. And nowadays, when we see black writers winning Jabuti Prize, Oceana Prize being translated, this in the 90s, we didn't have that. So the market in Brazil is all as open, much more than before. The readers are open, much more now. But none of this came out of the blue, We needed a lot of struggle, fight, resistance. My first novel, I had to pay for it to be published by Editora Masi, which was a small house. They didn't have so much money. I was, working for a year. We would go to the events, taking books, selling books. Cadernos Negros is here to, prove. So we have this generation of writers. And something else that is changing is the way, is the key to use to read the book. So for instance, there are a lot of young people from rap, culture that are, declaiming their texts, singing their texts. And although some critics insist to say no, but there is no way you cannot there's no way you read a rap lyrics as a literary text, you know? Today, you can notice there is another way of reading Carolina Maria de Jesus, but this came after a lot of discussion, debates, struggle, a lot of discussion asking what is the canon, who defends the canon, who created this canon. So there is a critical work, critical effort, not only a literary effort. There is this critics that help to create another type of reception to our work, not only our work, but in favor of a youth that has everything that they need.
Trazendo pouco do que Dona Conceição fala.
Bringing a little bit of what Dona Conceição was speaking, I'd like to ask Bernardini about the preservation of Black literature when we are constantly in combat with the silencing movements.
Preservation of Black literature is very interesting because what happens is that there is something we call erasure, where, Black people make progress and achieve things, for example, in literature, and then they disappear over the, once they're, even when they're alive, they disappear. So I'll just talk about a project that I initiated with my publisher, Penguin Random House in the UK, and it's called Black Britain Writing Back. And because I've been in the industry a long time now, I noticed that a lot of books had disappeared. Writers that I knew, their books were published, they maybe published 1 or 2 books and then they disappeared. And that always disturbed me because the next generation of writers would come on and they wouldn't realize that there were actually their predecessors, that people had laid the foundations before them. And so this project, Black Britain Writing Back, is where we republish books from the past for a new audience, for a contemporary audience and readership. And it's been a wonderful scheme. We've been doing it for 4 years now, and we've published 13 books. And the earliest book is one that was published in 1909 called Britons Through Negroes' Spectacles by somebody called A.B.C. Merriman. And he was a Sierra Leonean barrister who lived in London for a while, and it is a satire on the British. So he's looking at the British through a satirical colonial gaze, and it's an extraordinary book. And then we've published books from the 30s, from the 60s, from the 70s, and right through to books that were published 20 years ago that disappeared. And some of those writers who are still around have now gone on to republish new books, or sorry, rather gone on to publish new books, because the fact that their first books or second books have received more attention after a gap of, say, 20 or 30 years, this has led them to feel motivated to go back to writing, and they're back in the game and they're getting published. So this is a very practical measure of preservation of the literature. But in the UK we have the academy, so we have universities and we have English courses. English is studied at university level, English literature, and one of the ways in which canons are formed, literary canons are formed, basically it's through universities and the books that are studied and the books that are put on reading lists. And very often Black books are not on those reading lists unless there is a Black module. And then some Black books will be on the reading list, but generally they will be American or African American or African books and not British books. So that's something that we've been talking about and campaigning for quite a while, because books don't just enter the canon, although I don't actually believe in this idea of a single canon, but they don't have a life beyond the life of the writer automatically. Part of the way in which that happens is because they get onto reading lists. And then also schools, it's very possible for a child in a British school, and the research has been done on this, to go through their whole education system and not read a single book by a writer of colour, let alone a black British writer. So this is something that we've been working on. Actually, Penguin Random House has been working very successfully on changing the school governing, the sort of the school education boards reading lists, so that they become more diverse to reflect the society that we're in. And then there is the critical reception of books, you know, the reviews that you get in newspapers. Now, I understand that's not such a big thing here, but in the UK, your primary critical response will be in the literary pages of the newspapers and magazines, and they will then assess those books, and those books might achieve prominence, may even go on to win awards if they are very well reviewed. And that's something that we also have to campaign for, because a lot of black books aren't even reviewed in the main what we call the mainstream media.
São caminhos importantes e interessantes, né?
They are very important and interesting ways. So, Dona Conceição, how do you see this preservation of the literature? Some things that Bernardine has put, thinking about the distance and the historical time, but sometimes also in a coincident way, we could think in terms of Brazil. There is a black authorship in the Brazilian literature and its history. And this authorship is forgotten. Now, we affirm more frequently that the first abolitionist romance novel was written by Úrsula Maria Firmina dos Reis, a woman and a black writer. So the great reference books of the history of literature in Brazil, you can see a very small note about Maria Firmina dos Reis. So this invisibility, this lack of care with the black authorship has another place that is very severe in the Brazilian literature. It's very recent to read Machado de Assis as a black writer. The one that is considered the greatest writer of the Brazilian literature is not the literary critics really tried hard and worked hard to turn him into a white man, a white writer. Other writers descended not only from black, but also from indigenous persons. One of the poets of the Inconfidence in Minas, the independence movement, they don't point out these writers as descendants. So the history of the Brazilian literature has been really not really careful in this sense. So we have to think of the social movement, not only the black movement, but the teachers that are in the classrooms, the academics, the researchers are, at the end, the first ones to bring and to search for this text. The affirmative actions were very important because since some black students started to enter the universities, have access to the superior education, they started to reclaim this black authorship to appear with more evidence. And today, I think that it's very difficult to erase this black authorship because black writers are here, right, as it says, making noise. Of course, we need to rewrite the history of the Brazilian literature because today we have new names to be included, as well as we have names that need to be rescued from the forgotten.
I remember that I lived this rager process when I was an undergraduate student, and I thought even of giving up on university because I had no reference, nothing that could connect me as as black woman to that to rating that cinema because I am a filmmaker and nothing was talking about my universe, my life. And I remember that a black professor that I pay tribute today, he rescued me and brought this lens, this perspective of the black cinema for me to feel that I belong to that space at that moment onto the university. So it's very important, this exchange today. We are coming to an end. I'm sorry, I didn't want to tell you this, but we have to come to an end. And I'm gonna open to Bernardine and Conceição to bring their reflections because after I'm gonna call Amanda, she has to give you some information. So let's start with Bernardine, your final remarks.
Yeah, it's. I think I would really like to see more Black Brazilian writers published in English, because somebody asked me just a short while ago in the dressing room, what do English people think about Black Brazilians, or what do you think about Brazilians? And I had to think about it, and I thought, unless people come to Brazil, they don't. All they know is carnival. You know, when I came to Brazil in 1992, I had carnival in my head. As shameful as that is, that was all I knew about Brazil, really, and slave history. And so we don't know about Black Brazilians, I would say, in general. Obviously, there are always exceptions. We don't know about Black Brazilians. And Britain is very, very slow and quite lazy about publishing books in translation. And often when we do publish books in translation, they're of white authors. So I'd like to put it out there, if there are anybody who has any power to affect this, let's get some Black Brazilian authors published into English, because I feel that Black people around the world, we all connect to America, African Americans, but we don't connect enough to each other. Whether that's Black people in Europe, Black people in South America, Black people in other parts of the world, and we need to do that. And one of the ways we do that is to get those books translated into the languages they need to be translated into.
I have this will, I want to copy my cousin, always want to copy her because there are some differences, but also many similarities, connection points. And we as Brazilians, what we know, maybe a little bit more, the literary work and the theoretical work of Black women writer from North America, and even those writers, it took a long time for them to be translated here, and the critical work also took a long time to arrive here. And a lot of these translations are, made by Black people, and that's what we want a lot as well. And African writers of Portuguese language, Angola, Mozambique, Saint Tome and Prince, Cabo Verde, and uh, it's also interesting because they arrived. But first we had the white writers, and before we ever heard about Paulina Cisiani, everyone had already heard about Yakult. So Paulina arrives a lot later, a lot after Mia Couto, with all due respect and interest and beauty that her work is, but the beauty and the due respect and the work of Paulina Cisiani will arrive a lot after. And black women writers and from Latin America, we know not so much about them, and also from Caribbean, we don't know so much about, very few actually. And now we have Teresa Cardenas here with us, who is an Afro-Cuban writer, and how Teresa, took a long time to be translated into Portuguese here. Her book Cartas ao Cielo, Letters to Cielo. When Gilberto Gil was the Minister of Culture, we had Fernanda Felisberto and we were in Cuba, and we brought Cartas ao Cielo, Letters to Cielo from Teresa Cardenas, and could not publish it. So the book was published first into German, and today Cardenas has several books published here in Brazil. So this possibility of us reading colleagues that come from other countries is something that we are still building, But white writers arrive here easier, much easier and faster, and with a translation that is much more valuable than black writers. So the German black writer is going to be translated now, right? But it's recent, right? It's recent. There is something that is go beyond this literary text, right? Beyond literature. So there's the interest of the publisher, the publishing houses, and in translating what they believe that is worth it, that is worth being translated. Before calling Amanda here, I want to thank you for this exchange. I think I gained a lot of knowledge today. And I'd like so much to say that you were, jewels for our Black memory. You're precious. We are in this process of continuity, gathering tools to use the best way we can. And I think this process is all about going back and understand what our older ancestors did and move on, for next generation. So thank you all for being here. We have still a lot to happen today. Amanda, please. Carai, agora tá cheio. Tá cheio até. Stay where we are, standing, because something wonderful is going to happen here. I don't even know how I'm gonna handle it, but I'm here. I'm nervous. But let's go. I'm a black woman. I have strength. Dona Conceição Axé. I'm gonna address you now. Our movement, Cheetah Life, within all the turbulences, we can support all the crossroads that deal with dreams. And being alive as a black woman, as a queen, requires courage. You have to be courageous to be here, and as a black woman, Conceição Evarista is this lighthouse of courage for us. And since 2006, Conceição has been the most necessary presence in our editions. That's why we want to grant her the Écio Salles Award, that is given to someone who transforms the world, the country, with life and work. Flip understood that it's time to pay tribute to who transforms Brazil into life. When pay homage to someone that's so alive, such as the tears of women like you, they are tracing roots, they are tracing ways to to the future. And I'm gonna make you a proposal. Her look really makes me frightened. Really makes me afraid and thrilled. And because you are so sensible, and because we decided to grant you this award, we want to know if you accept to be our the person we're going to talk about in 2025, the one we're going to pay tribute to.
Não precisa responder agora não, tá, gente? Lá no off, gente.
You don't need to answer now, but thank you. I want to answer now. And I say yes. I didn't hear you. I accept. I super accept. Well, I want to thank you undoubtedly, all of you, for this award. Receiving it from a person that was so fundamental, so pivotal, who's the soul of Floop. I remember the last year that I was with her. I don't know. I don't know what to say. I can only feel. O som dela mal chega. Thank you, Conceição. What a wonderful moment. This is Floop. This is culture, this is knowledge. More applauses to Bernardine, to Conceição, to Rosario. Well, I want to invite here Jefferson Tenorio, my companion of so many nice moments.
Gente, mais uma vez, muito obrigada. E 2025, na fé, é nóis!
Vamos celebrar, vamos celebrar.